Hi, I'm Todd Pettigrew from Leech's Creek in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and I'm reading from Magic for Marigold, and this is Chapter 13, A Ghost is Laid, Part 1. That affair of the blueberry wine was certainly a bad business. There was some secret talk at Cloud of Spruce of sending Gwenny home after it, but nothing came of it, and Gwenny never even knew it had been mooted. It would never do to offend Luther and Annie, grandmother concluded, though for her part she couldn't understand Josephine. But the real reason was that they all liked Gwenny, in spite of, or maybe because of, her deviltries. An amusing compound of mischief and precocity, said Uncle Clon, who liked to be amused. Darn little minx, said Lazar, but he ran his legs off for her. A child of Beelzebub, said Salome, but kept the old stone cookie jar full of hop-and-go-fetchits for Gwenny. Gwenny might be saintly or devilish as the humor took her, but she was not a bit stuck up about her looks, and she had Annie Vincent's kind, ungrudging heart, and Luther Leslie's utter inability to hold any spite. As for Marigold, she and Gwenny had some terrible spats, but they had so much fun between the fights, they didn't greatly matter, though Gwenny had a poisonous little tongue when she got mad, and some things that rankled, especially about Clementine. Clementine's picture had been left on the orchard room wall when most of old grandmother's faded brides had been packed away in the old oblivion of the garret. There she hung in the green gloom, with her ivory white face, her sleek braided flow of hair, her pale beautiful hands, and her long lashed eyes forever entreating the lily. Marigold felt she would not have hated Clementine so much if she had looked squarely and a little arrogantly at you like the other brides, if you could have met her eyes and defied them. But that averted, indifferent gaze, as if you didn't matter at all, as if what you felt or thought didn't matter at all. Oh, for the others, Clementine Leslie might be dead, but for Marigold she was torturingly alive, and she knew father had only married mother for a housekeeper. All his love belonged to that disdainful lady of the lily, and Gwenny, suspecting this secret wound in Marigold's soul, turned the barb in it occasionally by singing the praises of Clementine's picture. The only faint comfort Marigold had was a hope that if Clementine had lived to be old, she might have become enormously fat like her mother up at Harmony Village. A good many Lawrences lived in or about Harmony, and none of them, it was whispered, cared very much for Lorraine, though they were always painfully polite to her. Marigold knew this, as she knew so many things older folks never dreamed of her knowing, and always felt, whenever old Mrs. Lawrence's eye rested on her, that she had no right to exist. If she could only have believed thoroughly that Clementine would have looked like her mother when she grew old, she would not have been jealous of her. For old Mrs. Lawrence was a funny old dame, and one is never jealous of funny people. Mrs. Lawrence was very proud of her resemblance to Queen Victoria, and dressed up to it. She had 3 chins, a bosom like a shelf, and a harmless if irritating habit of shedding hairpins wherever she went. Her favorite adjective was Christian, and she had a very decided dislike to being reminded that she was either old or fat. She constantly wore a brooch with Clementine's hair in it, and when she talked of her daughter, as she did very often, she snuffled. In spite of this, Mrs. Lawrence had many good qualities, and was a decent old soul enough, as Uncle Clon said. But Marigold saw only her defects and foibles because that was all she wanted to see in Clementine's mother, and it rejoiced her when Uncle Claude poked fun at Mrs. Lawrence's pet peculiarity of saving all her children's boots. It was said she had a room full of them, every boot or shoe that her family of four had ever worn from their first little slipper up, which did nobody any harm and need not have given Marigold such fierce pleasure. But when was jealousy ever reasonable? Part 2. Uncle Peter's son Royal had married and brought his bride home to Harmony. She was said to be unusually pretty, and even Aunt Josephine had said she was the most exquisite bride she had ever seen. There had been the usual clan jollifications in her honor, and now Uncle Claude and Aunt Marigold were giving a party for her, a fancy dress dance where all the young fry were to be masked. It sounded very interesting to Marigold and very provocative to Gwenny as they listened to Mother and Grandmother talking it over at the supper table. Both wished intensely they could go to that party, but both knew that they must go right to bed as soon as Mother and Grandmother had gone. "And be good little girls," said Grandmother warningly. "There's no fun in being a good little girl," said Gwenny, with a pout at Grandmother. "I don't see why we can't go to that party too." "You were not invited," said Mother. "You are not old enough to go to parties," said Grandmother. "Your day is coming," said Salome. Uncle Claude came out from Harmony for them in his car, already dressed in his fancy costume, a great flowered velvet coat that had belonged to some great across the sea, a real sword, and a powdered wig with lace ruffles at wrist and breast. Mother and Grandmother were not wearing fancy dress, but Grandmother was very splendid in velvet, and Mother very pretty in brown brocade and pearls. And Marigold felt delightfully that it was just a little bit out of a story, and she wished she could go up the hill and tell Sylvia about it. She had never even seen Sylvia since Gwenny came, and there were times when she was consumed with longing for her. But she never went up the hill. Gwenny simply must not find out about Sylvia. "Run on in, kidlets, and go to bed now," said Uncle Claude, grinning rather maliciously because he knew perfectly well how they hated it. "Don't call me kidlet," flashed Gwen. After the car had purred off in the twilight, she sat down on the veranda steps and would not say a word. Such a visitation of silence was rare with Gwenny, but Marigold rather welcomed it. She was glad to sit and dream in the lovely twilight, while Lucifer skulked like a black demon among the flower beds. It was not the Lucifer of old Grandmother's days. That Lucifer had gone where good cats go. But there had been another Lucifer to step into his four shoes, looking so exactly like him that in a few weeks it seemed just the same old Lucifer. There had been a procession of Lucifers and witches for generations at Cloud of Spruce, all looking so much alike that Fadim and Lazar thought they were one and the same, and concluded they were the old lady's devils. Salome, after milking, came along. "I'm going to bed," she said. "I've got a headache, and it's time you went too. There's lemonade and cookies for you in the pantry." "Lemonade and cookies," said Gwenny scornfully after Salome had gone in, leaving a couple of minxes at large at Cloud of Spruce. "Lemonade and cookies, and they are having all kinds of ices and salads and cakes at the party." "Well, there's no use thinking about that," said Marigold with a sigh. "It's 9 o'clock. We might as well go to bed." "Bed? I'm going to that party." Marigold stared. "The party? But you can't." Maybe I can't, but I will. I've been thinking it all out. We'll just go. It's only a mile in. We can easily walk it. We must be dressed up ourselves so that if someone sees us, they'll think we belong to the party. There's heaps of things in those old chests in the garret, and I'll make masks. We won't go in the house, just peep in at the windows and see all the dresses and the fun. So far had evil communications corrupted good manners that Marigold felt no qualms of conscience at all. It would certainly be interesting. And she was quite wild to see that exquisite bride and all the wonderful costumes. Uncle Peter's Pete, she had heard, was going as a devil. The only thing that gave her to think was whether they could really get away with it. What if grandmother catches us? She said. A fig for your grandmother. She won't. And if she does, what then? She can't kill us. Have some gizzard. Marigold had lots of gizzard. And in 10 minutes they were in the garret, tiptoeing cautiously, lest Salome hear them in the retreat of her kitchen chamber. The garret was rather a spooky place by candlelight, and Marigold had never been there after dark before. Great bunches of dried herbs hung from nails in the rafters, together with bundles of goose wings, hanks of yarns, and various discarded coats. Grandmother's big loom, where she still wove homespun blankets, was before the window. An old piano was in one corner, and there was some legend of a ghostly lady who played on it at times. And there was a chest under the eaves, filled with silken dresses, in which gay girls had danced years ago. Marigold had never seen the contents of that chest, but Gwenny seemed to know all about them. She must have been rummaging, Marigold thought. Gwenny had. One rainy day, when nobody knew where she was, and she knew what was in the big chest, but she did not know, and neither did Marigold, that the little gown of misty green crepe, with tiny daisies sprinkled over it, and a satin girdle with a rhinestone buckle in it, which was lying in a box on the top of the contents of the chest, had been a dress of Clementine's. Marigold knew that Clementine had been buried in her wedding dress, and that old Mrs. Lawrence had taken away the rest of her pretty gowns, but this one had been overlooked. Perhaps Mrs. Lawrence did not know it still existed. The first Mrs. Leander had her own reasons for keeping it, and it had remained in the box which she had placed it in all those years. "Here's the very thing for you," said Gwen. "I'm going as a fortune-teller with this scarlet cloak and hood and a pack of cards. They're all here together. Somebody must have worn them once to a fancy ball." Marigold fingered the emerald satin of the girdle lovingly. She adored satin. "But I can't wear this," she objected. "It's miles too big for me." "Put it on," ordered Gwen. "I can fix it for you. I'm a crackerjack at that. Ma says I'm a born dressmaker. Let's go down to our room. Salome will hear us creaking about up here." Marigold put on the daisy dress with its pretty short sleeves of lace and its round low neck. Oh, it was pretty, even if it were old-fashioned and wrinkled. Marigold was tall for her 10 years, and Clementine had been small and slight. Still, the dress was too long and loose. But resourceful Gwenny, with a paper of safety pins, worked marvels. The skirt was looped up at intervals all around, and the pins hidden under clusters of daisies Gwen got off an old hat, and which matched the daisies in the dress admirably. "Now, get your good slippers and pink silk stockings," commanded Gwen, sprinkling her own cloak and the green dress lavishly with Mother's violet water. "I've got to make our masks," which she proceeded to do, slashing ruthlessly into old grandmother's widow fall of stiff black crepe. Then she put on her own red stockings and fixed up a wand for herself out of an old umbrella handle with a silvery Christmas tree ball at the end and a Japanese snake of scarlet paper wreathed round the handle. Nobody could deny that Gwen was past mistress in her own particular brand of magic, and Marigold was lost in admiration of her cleverness. A few minutes later, two black-avised figures, one in green and one in red, slipped silently out of cloud of spruce and fled along the dark Harmony Road, while Salome slept the sleep of the just in the kitchen chamber, and Lucifer told the Witch of Endor that he'd be condemned if he ever let that young demon from Rush Hill walk him about the yard on his hind legs again. Part 3. Marigold, who was never frightened of the dark if she had anyone with her, enjoyed the walk to the village. It was a fairy night, with eerie pixie voices in the bracken. Why were the clouds racing across the moonlit sky in such a hurry? To what mysterious sky tryst were they hastening? An occasional rabbit frisked across the moonlit road. Marigold was half sorry when they reached the village. Luckily, Uncle Clon's house was in the outskirts, so they had no need of traversing the streets. They slipped up the side lane, squirmed through a gap in the privet hedge, boldly walked across the lawn, and found themselves at the window of the big room where the dancing was going on. It was open, and the blind was up, and they had a full view of the inside. Marigold caught her breath with delight. Oh, it was fairyland. It was like a little glimpse into another world. For the second time in her life, Marigold thought it might be really quite nice to be grown up. She remembered the first time long ago when she had only been 6, curled up on the ottoman in the spare room, watching an 18-year-old cousin dressing for a dance. When would she be like that? Not for 12 years. She groaned aloud. What's the matter, Sugar Pie? Sick? No, it's only it takes so long to grow up, sighed Marigold. Not so long as you think, remarked Grandmother, passing through the hall. And now again, for a moment, Marigold felt that it really took too long to grow up. The room was rosily lighted by a gay, enormous Chinese lantern hung from the ceiling. The floor was filled with dancers in the most wonderful dresses. There was gaiety in the very air. Lovely low laughter was everywhere, drifting out over the lawn in front and the flower garden behind. Aunt Marigold's dog was howling heartbrokenly to the music in his kennel. Such flowers, such lights, such music, such dresses! Most of the younger guests were masked, but few of the older ones were, and Marigold liked best to watch them because she knew them. There was Aunt Anne in gray lace over amber silk. Marigold had never seen Aunt Anne so magnificent before. Cousin Jen with a diamond wreath in her hair, and Cousin Barbara, who always had runs in her stockings, and Cousin Madge, who was the best dancer in the Leslie clan. Her very slippers would have danced by themselves the night through. Aunt Emma, who still wore her hair pompadour, and old Uncle Percy, whose wife had her hair bobbed 3 months before he ever noticed it. Old Uncle Nathaniel, with his great shock of gray hair reaching to his shoulders, and looking, so Uncle Clon was wont to say, like a lion that had eaten a Christian who disagreed with him. And sitting maskless by Aunt Marigold in the palm corner, a creature so lovely in her gown of pale pink chiffon embroidered with silver, and her hair folded about her head like a golden hood, that Marigold felt at once that this was the exquisite bride. Exquisite was the word. Marigold could hardly drag her eyes from her. It had been worth it all just to see her. Mother was dancing, actually dancing, and Grandmother was sitting by the wall, looking as if she didn't think much of foxtrots and tangos. Beside her, a stately old dowager in mauve satin, with hair arranged a la Victoria, and a cameo brooch with Clementine's hair in it. The sight of Mrs. Lawrence spoiled things for Marigold. She was quite ready to turn away when Gwen said, "We've seen all we can see from here. Let's take a sneak around to the dining room and have a look at the supper." But the dining room blinds were down and they could see nothing. "We'll go right in and see it," said Gwen. "Oh, do you think it's safe?" "Of course it's safe. Look at all the rigs here. We'll never be noticed. I'm going to see all that's to be seen, you bet." In they went. As Gwen said, nobody noticed them. The supper table proved such a dream that they hung over it breathlessly. Never in her life had Marigold seen such pretty eats, such dainty cakes and catelets, such wonderful striped sandwiches, such beautiful dishes. Cloud of Spruce could put up a solid banquet, but this alluring daintiness was something new. Gwen perceived sourly that there was no chance of swiping anything. There were too many waitresses around. So after they had looked their fill, she pulled Marigold grumpily away. "Let's take a peep at the other room and then get out." Hitherto all had gone well. They were reckless with success. Boldly they crossed the hall, and boldly they stood in the dancing room. The floor was not so crowded now. The August night was warm, and many of the dancers had gone out to the moonlit lawn. More of the old folks were sitting around the room. Mrs. Lawrence was more Queen Victoria than ever, as she languidly plied a huge ostrich fan of the vintage of the 90s. Old Uncle Percy was down at the end of the hall telephoning and shouting at the top of his voice as usual. Marigold thought of the clan's story about him and snickered. "What is that racket?" a caller in Uncle Percy's office had once asked. "Oh, that's only old Mr. Leslie talking to his wife down in Montague," the junior partner had replied. "Well, why doesn't he phone her instead of yelling across the island like that?" said the caller. Gwen turned to see why Marigold was shaking with laughter. Then the end of the world came. Gwen stepped on a small ball that somehow happened to be lying under the fringe of the portiere, shot wildly into the room, and fell with a curdling scream. As she felt herself shooting, she grabbed Marigold, who did not fall, but went staggering across the room on the slippery floor, and there sat neatly down at the very feet of old Mrs. Lawrence, who had just begun to tell grandmother how many times she had had the flu. The next moment, Mrs. Lawrence was all but in hysterics, and the room was full. Marigold had scrambled to her feet and was standing there dazedly, but Glen was still sprawled on the floor. It was Uncle Clon who picked her up and stripped the mask from her face. "I knew it was you." He stood her beside Marigold, from whose face someone else had removed the mask. "Oh, Marigold!" cried Mother in horror, but old Mrs. Lawrence was still the center of attraction. Until she could be revived and calmed, nobody had any spare time for Gwen and Marigold. "Clementine's dress! Clementine's dress!" Mrs. Lawrence was shrieking and sobbing. "The dress she wore when she came in to tell me she had just promised to marry Leander Leslie. I didn't think you'd let your daughter insult me so, Lorraine." "Oh, I had nothing to do with it. Truly I hadn't," almost sobbed Mother. "My heart broke when Clementine died, and now you have brought it up like this here." People made out between Mrs. Lawrence's youps. "Oh, I shouldn't have come. I had a presentiment. One of my dark forebodings came to me." "Calm yourself, Mrs. Lawrence. Here, try a sip of water," said Aunt Marigold. "Calm myself! It's enough to kill me. We all die. Sudden, unexpected deaths. Oh, Lorraine, Lorraine, you took her place, but your daughter might have left her dress, her sacred little dress, alone." "Oh, I didn't know," cried Marigold. She wanted to cry, but cry she would not before all these people. Had not old grandmother once said that a Leslie should never cry before the world? Yet it was plain that she had involved mother in some terrible disgrace. All the sense of mystery and romance had fled. She felt that she and Gwenny were only naughty, silly children who had been ignominiously found out. Mrs. Lawrence yelped more wildly than ever. Sorry, you'd better have her carried upstairs, said Aunt Marigold. She really has a weak heart, I'm afraid. Oh, Clementine! Clementine! Wailed Mrs. Lawrence. To think of the dress you wore being here! That dreadful child! Oh, Lorraine, how could you? Gwen, who had hitherto been rather dazed and sobered by the suddenness of the catastrophe, now wrenched her shoulder from Uncle Clon's restraining hand and sprang forward. Shut your face, you old screech owl, she said furiously. You've been told Aunt Lorraine had nothing to do with it. Neither had Marigold. It was me found that moldy old dress and made Marigold put it on. Now get that through your dippy old head and stop making a fuss over nothing. Oh, Claire, you'd like to boil me in oil and pick my bones, but I don't care that for you, you fat old cow. And Gwen snapped her fingers under outraged Queen Victoria's very nose. Mrs. Lawrence, finding someone else could make more noise than she could, ceased yelping. She got on her feet, scattering a shower of hairpins on the floor, with the noted Carberry temper sticking out of every kink and curve of her abundant figure, and assisted by Aunt Marigold and Uncle Percy, moved slowly to the stairs. One must make allowances, of course, she sobbed, for the things children will do. I am glad it wasn't your fault, Lorraine. I didn't think I had deserved that of you. Dear Mrs. Lawrence, don't be angry, implored Lorraine. Angry? Oh, no, I'm not angry. I'm only heartbroken. If God... You might as well leave God out of it, said Gwen. Gwen, keep quiet, said Uncle Clon furiously. Whereupon Gwen threw back her head and yelled loud and long. Everybody was now in the room or the hall, or crowding up to the windows outside. Marigold felt as if everyone in the world were staring at her. Could you run us home, Horace? Said Grandmother wearily. I'm tired, and this has about finished me. Do you want to stay for supper, Lorraine? No, oh no, said Lorraine, struggling to keep back her tears. In the back seat of the car, Marigold cried for sorrow, and Gwen howled for vexation of spirit. But Uncle Clon laughed so uproariously that Grandmother said nervously, Horace, do pay attention to your steering. I don't see how you can laugh. It's simply been a terrible affair. If it had been anyone else but old Mrs. Lawrence. Good for her, said Uncle Clon. I don't believe anyone ever told her the truth about herself before. It was priceless. Gwen stopped sniffling and pricked up her ears. After all, there was something nice about Uncle Clon. But it must have been a shock to see Clementine's dress suddenly come before her like that, said Grandmother. What was the matter with Grandmother's voice? Grandmother couldn't be laughing. She couldn't. But was she trying not to laugh? You know, Horace, she really worshipped Clementine. Clementine was a good little scout, said Uncle Clon. I always liked her. It was to her credit that she wasn't spoiled by such a silly old mother. She was a pretty thing, said Grandmother. I remember her in that dress. People raved about her skin and her hands. Clem certainly had pretty hands. It was a pity she had such huge feet, said Uncle Clon. She couldn't help her big feet, rebuked Grandmother. Of course not, but they were certainly generous, said Uncle Clon. No wonder the old lady kept all her boots. Too much good leather to waste. Clem had only one quarrel in her life that she never made up, a quarrel with Emmy Carberry. Emmy was going to marry a man neither Carberry's nor Lawrence's approved of. "I wouldn't be in your shoes for the world, Emmy," said Clem solemnly. "Well, don't worry, Clem, darling," said Emmy, sticking out a foot in her little number twos beside poor Clem's brogans. "You never could get into them." Of course, Clem never forgave her. Just then, in a twinkle, something happened to poor, crushed, weeping Marigold in the back seat. The spirit of jealousy departed from her forever, at least as far as Clementine was concerned. Clementine had big feet, and Mother had feet that even Uncle Clon thought perfection. Oh, Marigold smiled through her tear stains in the darkness. Oh, she could afford to pity Clementine. "Give me a good reason why I shouldn't take the hide off you," said Uncle Clon as he lifted Gwen from the car. "I made you laugh," said Gwen saucily. "You shameless young hussy," said Uncle Clon. Grandmother said nothing. Of what use was it saying anything to Gwen? Of what use was it trying to drown fish? And she was going home the next evening. Besides, in her secret soul, Grandmother was not sorry that Caroline Lawrence had got her comeuppance at last. "Well, this is the end of Wednesday. Now for Thursday. But they might have given us a bite to eat," grumbled Gwen, as she rolled into bed. "I wish I'd swiped that little plate of striped sandwiches. But did you ever see anything so funny as that old dragon yowling? Didn't I shut her up? I hope the devil flies away with her before morning. After all, I'm glad I'm going home tomorrow night, Marigold. I like you better than I ever dreamed I'd do after Aunt Jo's sickening praises. But your grandmother gets my goat." "Aren't you going to say your prayers?" reminded Marigold. "No use waking God up at this hour of the night," said Gwen drowsily. She was sleeping like a lamb before Marigold had finished her prayers. Marigold was very thankful and told God so. Not exactly that Clementine had big feet, of course, but that the horrible feeling of hatred and jealousy had gone completely out of her little heart. It was so comfortable. Mother gave Marigold a little scolding in the morning. "Mrs. Lawrence might have died of heart failure. Think of how you would have felt. As it is, we heard this morning that she cried all night, cried violently," Mother added, fearing that Marigold was not alive to the awfulness of what she had done. "Never you worry," said Salome. "It served old Madam right, her and her old boots, thinking she's like Queen Victoria. But all the same, I'm thankful that limb of Satan is going home tonight. I should really like to have a few minutes' peace. I feel as if I'd been run through a meat chopper these 3 weeks. Heaven helps the clan when she grows up." "Amen," said Lucifer, with an emphatic whisk of his tail. Gwenny went home that evening. "Now maybe we can call our souls our own again," said Salome. And yet she did not say it very briskly. Nor did she snub Lazar when he remarked mournfully, "By gosh, you'd think somebody was dying in the house." The lost serenity of Cloud of Spruce had returned to it, only slightly rippled next day by the arrival of an inky postcard from Gwen addressed to Grandmother. "I forgot to tell you that I dropped one of your best silver spoons through a crack in the apple barn floor day before yesterday. I think you can get it easily if you crawl under the barn." Marigold missed her badly for 2 days, and in a lesser degree for the 3rd. But after all, it was very nice to be alone with Sylvia again. Laughter and frolics were good things, but one didn't want to laugh and frolic all the time. She was like one tasting the beauty of quiet after days of boisterous, stimulating wind. The velvet faces of the pansies were waiting for her in the twilight, and her own intimate, beloved trees welcomed her once more to their fraternity. When she shut the little green gate behind her, she went into a different world, where one could be happy and have beautiful hours without being noisy all the time. She turned and looked down on the old vine-hung house and the harbor beyond. There was no sound in the great quiet world but the song of the wind, and there were soft dewy shadows in every green meadow nook of Mr. Donkin's farm. If I could have picked my place to be born, I'd have picked Cloud of Spruce, she whispered, holding out her arms as if she wanted to put them around the house. This beautiful old place that so many hands had made and so many hearts had loved. And Clementine's ghost was forever laid. The next time she went to the graveyard, she stole over and put a little flower on Clementine's grave. Poor, pretty Clementine. She no longer felt that she wanted to push her away from Father's side. And she knew now that Father hadn't married Mother for just a housekeeper, for she had told Mother the whole story, and Mother had laughed a little and cried a little. I was never jealous of Clementine. They were children. He did love her very dearly, but to me he gave the love of his manhood, I know. So Marigold had no further grudge against Clementine's picture. She could look at it calmly and agree that it was very beautiful. But once she gave herself the satisfaction of remarking to it, "It's a good thing your feet don't show."